Evil. It's a great plot twist. We're going to sort through the concept of evil with Professor Ahmed Ragab of Harvard School of Divinity. Ahead on Science Goes to the Movies. Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Faith Saley. Today, we're going to look at the movie Split with Professor Ahmed Ragab of Harvard Divinity School. Welcome.
Thank you for
being here. In M. Night Shyamalan's new movie Split, James McAvoy gives a tour de force performance as Kevin, one individual with 23 personalities, and not all of them are so nice.
Help me get out of here, Hedwig.
Are you trying to trick me? I'll tell on you.
Aren't you the clever one?
An individual with multiple personalities can change their body chemistry with their thoughts.
Someone's coming for you.
Who's coming?
The beast.
There's a man here. He abducted us and he's going to kill me. We're meant for something. Something horrible.
The world will understand now. The beast is real.
So, Ahmed, the movie raises a lot of questions about evil. So let's start with the function of evil. In a movie, the function of evil is very clear and specific. It creates a story that allows us to see the good, right? Is that how it works in real life, do you think? Is evil a litmus test for what is good?
Well, I would say more that both good and evil constitute one another, that the existence of one is related to the existence of the other, and that both of them are categories that we create to evaluate or to distinguish specific acts and behaviors that we do in our society. So evil is a category that is useful in making sure that particular behaviors are extreme or are completely ostracized or removed from action, but also from even thought, that people no longer think about them. And that is and can be a very useful function for evil in a social context. But in the same way, evil has been and continues to be used to describe marginalized groups, marginalized genders and sexualities, to describe them as evil or evildoers. And in doing so, it also serves to marginalize them from, from the society in general. And finally, even when we use evil to describe, as a category, to describe particular behaviors that we think should never be thought about, this can actually even serve to normalize somewhat similar behaviors. So think, for instance, if we think about slavery as evil, it helps us think about what happened, about this particular episode of human history as an atrocity, which it was. However, because it is so ostracized from our thinking, it allows us to be more comfortable with things like forced labor, with things like incarceration, which are very close to slavery, but the ostracization of slavery by calling it just pure evil
Just puts it over here.
Exactly.
I never thought about that.
In a way, I mean, the work of Hannah Arendt on the banality of evil comes to mind, where she basically tells us or describes how such an evil like the Holocaust was not only perpetrated by the devil incarnate, but in many cases by just regular people. And this is the banality of it.
That's the most terrifying part, right? Is the banality of it and the creeping increments.
Exactly.
Movies and other stories offer huge variations on the role of suffering. In Split, suffering both creates a monster and saves a girl. In The Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien sees pain as a pathway to evil. Sauron created the malignant race of orcs by torturing elves until they became evil. Ahmed, you study religions from all over the world. Is there any consensus on the interplay between suffering and evil?
Not exactly, no. I mean, as you mentioned, suffering can be a way of salvation in a way, and a path towards redemption, in the same way that it can lead to the creation of evil. And in all the examples that you mentioned, it is in art in general, and in a number, and in religious mythology as well. Suffering can sometimes work to expose particular flaws in the making of evil. But at the same time, it can create what we can describe as the grotesque, for instance. So the orcs are a representation of the grotesque, which is the grotesque acquires its power, its narrative power, from, on one hand, its similarity to what we are, and also from its difference. So the orcs are such compelling characters precisely because they are very much like the elves. They are very much characters that we can understand. And the character in Split is also very compelling because it is just like us.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it is so different. And therefore, it is not extremely variant. This kind of tension between what's like us and what's different from us, sometimes that gets to be created through suffering, becomes is part basically of how these characters are so compelling and so attractive.
Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, wrote, "No man chooses evil because it is evil. He only mistakes it for happiness, the good he seeks." And in the movie Split, part of Kevin Wendell Crumb believes he is doing the right thing by releasing a beast that kills old ladies and eats young girls. I think some of the most terrifying characters in movies are the people who believe that they can do evil as a way of creating good. From where you're sitting, is evil a point of view?
Well, in a way, it is. It is a point of view in thinking about it. It is a social point of view, and ultimately, most the worst atrocities in human history have been done by people who believe that they were doing good. But the fact that they believe they are doing good doesn't make it necessarily good. So, you know, from eugenics to genocides to all sorts of atrocities that happen throughout human history, and there are many of them that happened and continue to happen. There are these people who believe what they are doing is justifiable, what they are doing is better for, will make life better for themselves or for their groups or for their races or genders or whatever. And again, that doesn't necessarily make it good. I think the key point that is important for us to understand is again what Hannah Arendt explains, which is there is a way of justifying and rationalizing the most horrible of acts, and therefore it would be important for us to always think about these kinds of, or not take these justifications as a way to justify the atrocities that can be built on them. So again, there are a lot of reasoning that can be put behind all of these atrocities that happen throughout human history.
I mean, the Holocaust is the most egregious and blatant example, but can you talk more about this sort of world history of seeing outsiders and others as evil?
So, I mean, to think, for instance, about eugenic sciences and the resulting racist laws, but also genocides in many parts around the world, ultimately, eugenicists had in their mind that they constituted, or that the white races constituted the superior races for humanity, and that preserving a form of purity for these races, but also the extermination of other races, is the way forward for humanity. In a way, in the movie Split itself, the monster is out there to create a new future for humanity, a new future through the elimination of the weak. And all these, you know, in a way, of course, these ideologies resulted in these atrocities and genocides that we saw in different parts around the world, and that we continue to see happening in, you know, all over the world. But ultimately, the reasoning is there. Now, because it has a reasoning doesn't make it any better. And I think that's the key point, that evil is not always committed by, again, devils incarnate who are just out there to do harm, knowing that it is harm. On the contrary, it is done by ordinary humans who believe in something and who do go to great lengths to just achieve what they believe is the right thing to do.
In that view, could you call evil a mistake, a grievous error in our efforts to be good?
Well, I think it is more a reflection of of a lot of the power hierarchies and structures that we have in our society, of the different forms of discrimination, belittling of lives, or the various hierarchies that we create around lives. So the idea, again, if we look at in the movie Split, the monster understands himself to be superior to everybody else. He understands the lives of little girls to be inferior. It is a reflection of this kind of hierarchy of life that exists in the minds of so many people. From this view, this hierarchy of life, you have evils like anti-Semitism and like racism and like, you know, genocides and misogyny. All of this comes again from a particular view of hierarchical
Superiority,
existence. Exactly.
Yeah. There are a myriad of films out there that about like an evil force, right? An evil doll or an evil spirit. Do most religions visualize evil as an entity, you know, as a material force that's ubiquitous and inexorable?
Not exactly. I mean, this is more common in the Abrahamic traditions than other traditions, and it is more common in monotheistic traditions to have evil being incarnate in particular figures or specific things. Like, you know, again, the character of the devil, for instance, as a specific figure that is evil and that instigates evil. While in many other traditions, it is not necessarily something that is related to particular entities, but it is more diverse and it has different meanings. Now, that being said, the notion of connecting evil to specific objects, for instance, or how specific objects become invested with a particular form of force or power is related in many cases to how objects become repositories of memory. So the object itself gets to be invested with a lot of memories that make a particular object ominous or evil. And that doesn't relate, and you know, you have similar objects of that sort in a variety of cultures and a variety of religions. And again, it is related to the connection of materiality with a specific social structure of memory.
In the movie, Kevin Wendell Crumb sees an approaching beast that is evil, and he also struggles with mental illness. Now, you've studied science and religion. You are a PhD and you are an MD.
That's right.
What do you think? Is evil an illness? I mean, these characters in the movies who are truly evil all seem mentally ill.
Well, I mean, maybe we can also ask, is illness evil? And in a way, I think the question can be asked in both ways. On one hand, characterizing evil as illness is a way of explaining it and also a way of dismissing it. Because in a way, we are a little safer when we realize that evil is the result of illness. It is something that is more in our control. We can blame specific institutions, specific medications, even doctors.
I would say it's less in our control in a comforting way. If evil is an illness, I can't help getting sick, right? It's something that happened to me. I didn't ask to be evil. Right.
But in a way we can, so yes, if it is affecting you, then yes, it is less in your control. But in relation to an evil person out there, the notion that it's an illness that can be cured, that can be medicated, is in a way a comforting thought. And at the same time, the notion of illness itself, and can illness or is illness an evil, is an important and a compelling question, both at the philosophical and metaphysical level, but also at the very practical level and the social level, in terms of how so many diseases throughout human history have been thought of as signs of evil, as punishments for evil people, or as just pure evil, essentially. And, you know, the movie obviously links, again, mental illness with a particular performance of evil, which is a rather repetitive trope, the notion of thinking about mental illness as something that is that is not as biological as other diseases, but is rather something that goes to the realm of the moral more than other diseases. And that's something that a lot of people who work on mental illness, of course, talk about and try to advocate against. That again, we need to think about mental illness in a different way.
I think everybody agree. Like the first person who comes to mind when you think of evil incarnate, first real person is Hitler.
Yes.
Does everybody agree, everybody who does what you do, agree that Hitler was mentally ill?
I don't think so. I don't think people agree that he was mentally ill.
See, that just give me chills. Like that makes me scared.
Yes.
Thought you were going to say, yeah, everybody knows he was mentally ill. How else could he pull that off?
But that's, I mean, it is so interesting. We keep going back to Hannah Arendt again. And this is the idea. Evil can happen by regular people who are not sick, but who just have, different kinds of regards of human life, who understand the world in a different way and can perpetuate this. And they are often aided by other people who are not sick either. And that's what we see in the Holocaust. It is perpetuated by people who are not sick, who in many cases were just, quote unquote, just doing their job. But in doing their job, they ended up killing millions of people.
You're referencing Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil. Do you think most evil is banal?
I think the most dangerous kinds are. I think the evil that is not banal is probably the one that we can limit its effects more easily. I think the real problems are with this banal evil, because that's the thing that can affect more and more people, and that's the thing that can spread throughout society without us being able to even notice it. And the way that, societies can change so easily and can fall into more forms of racism, of xenophobia, of misogyny, this kind of gradual but sustained move towards hatred and towards evil is what we've seen happen before. And I think the main message...
many people would say we're seeing it happen now.
Exactly. And I think that's why her book is probably extremely important at this moment. Because again, previous atrocities did not happen just because people were mentally ill or because they were devils. They were such terrible atrocities precisely because they were regular people.
In Split, Kevin has multiple personalities, most of whom are good. Mm-hmm. Can one psyche be both some good and some really, really, really bad?
I think this is what's so interesting about this particular movie, is that it's using the split personalities to give us, to give basically a tapestry of different emotions and different views. But ultimately, the monster, which is really the most evil figure of all the different personalities, is the product of his own context, is really the product of his living in the zoo, of basically incorporating a lot of these things around him. And the two characters that end up, that are serving the monster essentially, and that are kidnapping people or that are trying to provide the food, if you will, for the monster, are themselves the product of his weakest moments, were produced in a way to protect him against some forms of insult or some forms of, ostracization. And I think what's really interesting about this movie is this process of the production of evil through context, through the life of a particular person, as opposed to the existence of particular characters that are inherently evil.
Yeah, allowing the audience to sort of investigate its origins.
Exactly, and there is always the question. Now, these two characters that are aiding the monster and sort of worshipping the monster have been presumably banished from the light for a very long time. They never presented, the doctor or psychiatrist never met them. And after you finish the movie, there is this lingering question. Would it have been better if they were also given a chance to talk, or would it have been worse? And there is really no answer to that. It is, again, I think this is one of the interesting things about the movie, is that this is something that remains out there, whether it was, how context in a way produces this kind of evil.
Do you have a favorite movie that so many movies deal with evil, right? Because we need a dramatic villain
right.
in some way. But do you have a favorite embodiment or depiction of evil in cinema?
Well, I am, my favorite movies in the world are Star Wars. So obviously, and Darth Vader is, I think, the most compelling figure in this regard, the most compelling representation of evil. And
Why? Can you break down why Darth Vader is so evil?
I mean, I think he's compelling not only because he's so evil, but because of the trajectory of how he is, in a way, a person who taps into this dark side of the Force. So we have the making of the Force in the Star Wars universe is so complex that we have the sort of the dark side of the Force, and we have the good side of the Force.
Good and evil.
Right, but at the same time, they are not entirely separate. The separation is more the work of the Jedi and the work of the Sith. But the Force itself is one and the same. And although it is always separated into these two sides, ultimately the prophecy is about the person who brings balance to the Force. And in a way, as a viewer myself, I would argue that ultimately Darth Vader was or Anakin Skywalker was the one, because in his ability to bring together both sides of the Force, he brought balance to the Force. And so through this trajectory of his life, of how he is this person conceived essentially in a virgin birth by the Force, and ultimately dying in this ultimate state of conversion from the dark side to the light side, or to the good side of the Force, this trajectory is extremely compelling. And he is a compelling character with these kinds of deep flaws from the beginning, including his pride, his feeling of his own superiority, his inability to control his emotions. So we have a very interesting and a very compelling character that goes well beyond this kind of black and white or good and bad binary, if you will. How
do you account for balance with Anakin Skywalker when he does an act as evil as killing children?
Well, I think the story, I think this is really the most compelling thing about this particular character and about the Star Wars story, is that it is not a happy ending story. The balance in the Force is not necessarily the triumph of good. It is far more complex than this, I would say. So even, not only in the character of Anakin himself, who goes through this trajectory of being a person who wants to be and becomes really a Jedi, and then gets to be transformed into the most evil figure in the Empire, and then even tries to, in a way, recruit his son and overthrow the Emperor to become the Emperor himself, but then ultimately ends up killing the Emperor and essentially delivering the end of the Empire. So this particular character, the arc that it moves through the different movies is extremely compelling, precisely because it is not simple. And, Luke Skywalker himself, we see his changes. We see him becoming a darker character with time until he is in the final movie of the original trilogy. He is just all in black in a way that made people think that he would eventually move to the dark side. And it is precisely this kind of complexity, how life in this particular universe, but also how this battle between good and evil ends up ultimately by making everybody a little bit evil. The cruelty, the violence, the death that is part of it is something that is a constituent part of this kind of the production of these characters. So again, what makes this particular saga so compelling for me is precisely this complexity, this deep complexity, and that it is far from being a question of just good versus evil. It is really about the making of good and evil through this battle, and where each one of them keeps changing through this battle.
When you're teaching at Harvard Divinity School, do you reference blockbuster films and iconic pop culture characters?
Absolutely. And I think it is, these cultural icons are extremely important because they allow us to, on one hand, use a language that is used in society, references that, on one hand, represent what people are thinking about, but also become part of the cultural lexicon, if you will, that people use in order to think about their own lives. So, Darth Vader is a figure that lives in our minds. It becomes a way we use in order to think about what is good and what is bad. And in thinking about all of these important moments in the cultural tapestry that we're living in, it allows us to do more deeper analysis of how people live their lives and about the social condition in general.
Ahmed, this was fascinating, and I'm going to read The Banality of Evil. Sounds like everybody should.
I think so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for today. Whatever we can't fit into this half hour, we'll share on our Science Goes to the Movies Facebook page. And if you want to watch past episodes, please check us out at www.cuny.tv under the Science tab, or download our app to keep up with everything related to Science Goes to the Movies all in one place.